As always, quick reminder, guys, stats are based on PPR, recommendations based on 12-team leagues. I'm going to highlight a few key players at each one of the positions, as I mentioned earlier. I'll highlight through a couple from each position, but I'll list off all 12 of the top 12 from each one of the key positions. And we've got week 4 this week. There's been some craziness through week 3. We've had some injuries. We had some crazy kicker finishes with blocks and special teams doing all kinds of stuff. But hopefully we don't see a lot of that, and we can start hitting some really, really good finishes this week. So let's go into the QB1s this week. Last week we had a pretty good week. I'll define it as a heater. Out of the 12 quarterbacks that we picked last week, 8 finished in the top 12 as QB1s in a 12-team league. Our fade that we had last week, I picked Kyler Murray, who was at San Francisco, hadn't been good there. Guess what? Finished outside the top 12 at QB 16. He only threw for 159 passing yards. Great fade. So if you listen to that, that worked out for you. Let's get on to what the rankings are for this week. This week, number 1 overall, I've got Patrick Mahomes, who is at home for Kansas City against Baltimore. He was QB 20 last week, had a little bit of a low game, but I think he bounces back this week. At number 2, I think it's going to be a huge shootout game. I've got Lamar Jackson at Kansas City. Last week, he was QB 3, despite being sacked 7 times, but I think Kansas City is going to make it tough for them to run. I look for Patrick and Lamar to pace the quarterbacks this week at 1 and 2. At number 3 this week for quarterbacks, I've got Josh Allen at home in Buffalo versus the New Orleans Saints. Probably going to be a blowout, but Josh puts up numbers every week. He was QB 5 last week. At number 4 this week, I've got Justin Herbert at home for the Chargers against Denver. This is a Monday night game. It's going to be in prime time, and we've watched Justin Herbert put up numbers this year. The biggest thing for me is he's healthy. He looks good. He was QB 12 last week. I think even against Denver, they showed a little chink in the armor where I think he's going to put up good numbers, be QB 4 this week. At QB 5 this week, I've got Geno Smith at home for the Las Vegas Raiders versus Chicago. He was QB 4 last week, and I'll go into a little bit of detail in a minute on why I like him at QB 5 for this week. At QB 6, I've got Jalen Hurts. He's going to travel to Tampa Bay for the Philadelphia Eagles. Last week, we saw them turn it on in the second half, and Hurts showed us what having some all-pro receivers and being a good quarterback was all about. He ended up as QB 2 for week 3. At QB 7 for me this week, I've got Caleb Williams. I was huge on him coming in the year. Him and Chicago are traveling to Las Vegas to play the Raiders. Caleb Williams put up a QB 1 week last week, and I think he's going to be QB 7 this week. At QB 8, I've got the guy who finished QB 7 last week. He has a rushing floor. He does everything he needs to do, and it's Drake May, who's going to be at home for the New England Patriots versus the Carolina Panthers. He was QB 7, like I said, last week. He has the running. He put it together last week, found Hunter Henry several times. I think he's going to be good for QB 8. At QB 9 for me this week, I just can't quit him. It's Bo Nix for the Denver Broncos at the LA Chargers. He was QB 19 last week. He hasn't quite put it together. But if you watched last year for the Broncos, once they kind of opened the playbook up and did some things, Nix took off. And I think that's going to happen again this year. I've got him at QB 9 this week. At QB 10, I've got Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers traveling to Dallas to play the Cowboys. Jordan was QB 26 last week, but I really like him at QB 10 this week, and I'll go into that in a minute. At number 11 this week, I just can't fade him anymore. He's going to consistently stay in the top 12 until we find a reason for him not to be there. It's Daniel Indiana Jones. He is taking the Giants, or not the Giants. I keep saying that. I said that last week. He's taking the Colts to L.A. to play the Rams. Interestingly enough, early Vegas has this game as the highest scoring game at 49.5 points. So I've got Daniel Jones at QB 11, which is exactly where he finished last week, QB 11. At number 12, I've got Kyler Murray from the Arizona Cardinals, who's going to be at home versus the Seattle Seahawks. I think the Seahawks defense is going to give him some trouble like the 49ers did last week. But Murray's better against Seattle than he has been against San Francisco, and he's also at home. So he was QB 16 last week. Like I said, a good fade for us, and I've got him at QB 12 this week. Before I get too deep in who I really like, the couple of quarterbacks that I like higher than consensus this week, I want to throw out a couple of injuries to watch. We've got Jaden Daniels and Brock Purdy both listed as day-to-day. We've obviously got Joe Burrow out this week, J.J. McCarthy out this week, and an interesting turn of events, we're going to have Jackson Dart starting for the New York Giants in place of Russell Wilson. A couple things to keep your eye on there. Daniels and Purdy, for me, if I knew for a fact they were playing, they would probably jump up in that top 12, interchangeable around that 12 spot with Murray. So just keep an eye on the practice report, see if they're playing, see if they're more than just day-to-day. My biggest consensus differentials this week, at number 5, I have Geno Smith. Yeah, last week he was QB4. He's at home in Las Vegas this week to face the Bears. The reason I like him so much is Chicago was the 3rd worst pass defense in all the NFL through 3 weeks. They give up the most passing yards to quarterbacks and passing points in fantasy, 3rd most in all of the fantasy football. He's actually listed as QB 14 overall for the year. And like I said, he's had some hit or misses, but I really think he's going to be good here. This Vegas game total has them at 47.5 points this week between the two teams, which is one of the higher. Like I said, the 49.5 from Indy and the Rams is the highest of the week, but 47.5 is pretty high. The Bears are only 1.5 point favorites in this game. That means there could be some shootout potential, and there could be a possibility the Bears get ahead a little bit early where Geno's going to be able to throw it a lot. I like him as QB5 this week. My other consensus quarterback pick, or goes against consensus, is Jordan Love. He was QB 26 last week. I've got him at QB 10. Again, this is totally matchup driven, even though I love Jordan Love and I think he's got a lot of talent. He can put up big games. This is going to be one of those. At Dallas versus the Cowboys, the Cowboys give up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Jordan Love is going to take advantage of that just the same way as the last 2 weeks. The Cowboys defense was completely diced up by Russell Wilson and Caleb Williams. Those guys looked like world beaters and were QB1 on the week doing things. Russ Wilson had a 450-yard, multiple touchdown game. And like I said, Caleb Williams finished QB1 just this past week. So Love did have a down week. Like I said, QB 26 this past week. But, I mean, it was against Cleveland. Cleveland's made everybody look pretty bad. With Green Bay being only 7-point favorites, not huge, a 47.5 point total, I expect Love to produce and spread the ball around, and I wouldn't be shocked with multiple touchdowns. Jordan Love at QB 10 this week. My biggest fade for the quarterbacks, and I don't like this because as a player, I like him. I love his commercials, love everything about him. It's Baker Mayfield this week. I don't want to fade him, but there's way too many reasons to fade him, not to. A lot of people have him in their top 12. He was QB8 last week. We've watched him 3 weeks in a row pull a miraculous comeback out of a hat and do that. But guess what? Mike Evans got hurt last week. Crazy enough, he's had a hamstring injury in every season of his career. He has another one. He's expected to miss between 2 and 4 weeks with that hamstring injury. And Baker is playing the Eagles. The Eagles are the 5th best defense against quarterbacks in fantasy football. Add that to the fact that Emeka Egbuka, the superstar rookie wide receiver, was a little banged up, didn't quite look himself last week. And then you got Jalen McMillan, who's on IR. And we don't know if Chris Godwin's going to be back this week or not. And even if he is there a snap count? Is he as healthy as he once was? You throw all that out there, and I've got Baker probably around 16 to 18 this week in the QB rankings. I'm fading him out of my top 12. Moving on to running backs for this week. Let's hit on what we did last week. We hit 6 of 12 of our 12 picks in the top 12. made it, and that's not too bad. We called out Jordan Mason at number 11, and he made it all the way to RB7 this past week, which was fantastic. And I'll eat a little crow here. I did. Last week, I intentionally picked Jonathan Taylor to fade. I thought that the Colts would be in control and that they would rely on Daniel Jones and not so much on Jonathan Taylor. Big mistake. Jonathan Taylor looks every bit the superstar running back that he's always been, and that was a terrible fade. He absolutely obliterated Tennessee, was the RB1 on the week, and that was a tough call. Moving into this week, though, for running backs, we've got Christian McCaffrey at RB1. Him and the San Francisco 49ers will travel to Arizona to play the Cardinals. McCaffrey was RB6 last week. It's almost impossible if he's healthy and doesn't have an injury designation. How do you not put him in RB1? I mean, he's I think I saw some things earlier this week. He's listed as like wide receiver 7 on just receiving stats. So McCaffrey's RB1 this week. At RB2, I've got Bijan Robinson. Him and the Atlanta Falcons will will be at home versus the Washington Commanders this week. Last week, Bijan tied for RB12 in what was a juicy matchup. Had him ranked pretty high last week against Carolina, but the Panthers had otherwise ideas and ended up beating the Falcons 30-0, took Bijan straight out of the game. I don't think that happens again versus Washington. RB2 for Bijan. At RB3, I've got Devon Achane. Devon Achane and the Miami Dolphins will be at home versus the New York Jets. Again, keep thinking the Jets have a great defense, but they're not that great. Last week, Achane was tied for running back 12, got him at RB3 this week. Number 4, personal favorite of my own, James Cook. He's going to be at home cooking versus New Orleans. He was RB8 last week. He's going to continue to be in the top 10, top 5 every single week. I've got him at RB4. At RB5, I've got Jordan Mason. Technically, it's an away game as it's listed as at Pittsburgh, but this game is going to be your early Sunday morning game in Dublin, Ireland. I'm going to touch back on him, why I like him so high this week. At number 6, coming in as RB6, Jonathan Taylor at the LA Rams. The Colts are going to go to the Rams, and like I told you before, Vegas has this at 49.5 points, highest scoring game of the week. Taylor was RB1 last week. I simply cannot fade him. I can't put him any lower than 6th, and even against the vaunted Rams defense, I think even Vegas knows there's going to be points here, and Taylor's going to be a part of that. At number 7, I've got the RB1 from last year, and it's Jonathan Taylor is having in this type of year, but maybe even better. It's Saquon Barkley. Him and the Philadelphia Eagles are going to travel to Tampa Bay, as I touched on in the Baker Mayfield part. Barkley was only RB30 last week. The Eagles were forced to pass as they got down pretty high early. But this week, I don't think that'll happen. I think they're going to keep it in control against Tampa, and we're going to see Saquon Barkley on a healthy dose as RB7. At RB8, I've got Josh Jacobs with the Green Bay Packers, who travel to Dallas. I think Dallas's defense is one of the worst we've seen in the NFL this year. They continue to get beat through the air and on the ground. And Jacobs, despite being RB19 last week, I think him and Jordan Love both have excellent weeks. At RB9, I've got Bucky Irving at home in Tampa versus Philadelphia. I think he's going to get some volume there. I think he's going to catch some passes. He was RB15 last week. I like him at RB9 this week. Number 10. It's hard to fade him this low, but I can't go much higher. Don't want to go lower. It's Jahmyr Gibbs. The Cleveland Browns are traveling to Detroit to play the Lions. We keep seeing what the Lions did. They imposed their will against the Ravens and just made them look terrible. Gibbs was a decent part of that. He was RB3 on the week, and I think he's RB10 this week. At number 11, despite the fumbling issues, I've got Derrick Henry at Kansas City. He was RB25 last week with the fumble and with things falling kind of out of favor against the Lions. But I like him this week against Kansas City. Kansas City's a tough rushing defense, but Derrick Henry is a volume guy, and I think Baltimore's going to want to feed him. At number 12, I've got Breece Hall, where the New York Jets are traveling to Miami. Breece was only RB31 last week, but I like him a lot this week, and I'll touch on that here in a second. from why I like him at number 12. Not a lot of injuries to touch on at running back outside of the fact that James Conner went down. Most people have jumped on Trey Benson as a backup there. Keep your eye on that. Conner is done. You might want to throw Najee Harris in there as a running back who got injured. Some people probably had him rostered, but at the same time, he's on IR and done for the year as well. So those are two things to keep your eye on the backups there and see how that kind of plays out this week in Arizona and for the Chargers. My biggest consensus differentials this week is 2 weeks in a row for him, and I just can't say enough about him. It's Jordan Mason. He's the RB1 now for the Minnesota Vikings with Aaron Jones out. And like I said, we just touched on injuries. We knew Aaron Jones is done for a while. Jordan Mason is the starter in Minnesota. A home game for the Pittsburgh Steelers, technically speaking, but not really. Whenever you have an international game, kicks off early on Sunday mornings for East Coast, etc. This is in Dublin, Ireland, and it's going to be a big deal. Pittsburgh has issues with the run. If you know a Steelers fan, you've heard them talk about, we got to stop the run, we've got to do stuff. They're in the bottom half rush defenses for fantasy football, and Minnesota gave Mason all he could handle last week, and he responded with an RB7 week. With Carson Wentz starting quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings, J.J. McCarthy's been injured, and Wentz is now kind of game managing, if you will. I expect more of the same this week. They're going to feed Mason early and often against the Steelers team, and they're going to dare them to be able to stop the run. And I think that's going to be a good game for Jordan Mason. The Vikings are 2.5-point favorites there. Game script could come into play, but it's going to be at least close with the Vikings slightly favored. So Mason's going to get a ton of touches, and when he gets touches, he's RB1 material. I've got him at RB5 this week. My other biggest lean this week in running backs is Breece Hall. I've got him at my RB12. He travels to Miami with the New York Jets. Despite the fact he was RB31 last week, Jets are kind of back and forth. They had lost Justin Fields last week. There's a good chance they get him back this week against Miami as he was out for a concussion. This game is going to come down to Breece Hall getting touches against the fifth worst rushing defense for fantasy purposes. The Dolphins have made everybody kind of look like RB1s every week, and Breece Hall's not going to be any different. He's also had 2+ receptions in each of the 3 games this week, and I expect him to get the ground game going as well as catching passes out of the backfield. Ironically, Vegas has Miami favored by 2.5 points, which I think plays into Breece Hall's script much better than the bruiser Braylon Allen behind him. We're going to see Hall on the field a lot, and I think he cracks the RB1 status as RB12 this week. My fade this week, some fantasy owners, if you own him or have him in your leagues, the managers, and you drafted him, you picked him early, it's Chase Brown, running back for the Cincinnati Bengals. The wheels have fallen off that bus completely. We've got Burrow out at quarterback. Browning's slightly capable filling, but even before that, when Burrow was playing, Chase Brown was getting all the touches and no points. Like I said, I probably don't have to explain this to many people. They're traveling to Denver for a Monday night showdown. The backup quarterback is there. Their offensive line is mediocre at best. Chase Brown was running back 43 last week. Yeah, you're talking about a guy who was picked probably late first round or even at the turn in the 1-2 round in redrafts and doing stuff like that. He's got 14.5 points combined over the last 2 weeks. He's just not doing it. We even saw the rookie Taj Brooks get a couple of touches last week where he hadn't been getting those. I think we might see Brooks's role increase a little bit, and I'm absolutely fading Chase Brown. There's no way I see him getting in the top 12 this week at running back. Moving on to wide receivers, this has been tough. There's been a lot of jump around wide receivers. We've seen some hit games. We've only seen a handful of names stay truly consistent. And, that's tough, but that's to be expected. Every year we go into fantasy drafts and we see things. And I swear, when you look at people's rankings and you look at another ranking and you look at other rankings and you see all that stuff, there's like 47, maybe 50 wide receiver 2s, when in reality, wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 are going to be 12 apiece for 12 teams. So the most you're going to get is 24, your top 24 wide receivers. We're seeing some of that this week. My biggest fade last week was Drake London for the Atlanta Falcons versus the Carolina Panthers. I'm not going to go out on a limb here and say that I saw the Panthers beating them 30-0, but I didn't imagine that the Falcons were going to be able to get anything going in the air, and I imagined they would dominate mostly on the ground. Fade in London was a great call as he finished as wide receiver 35 last week. For my wide receiver rankings this week, I really, really like Puka Nacua at number 1. Him and the Rams are at home versus Indianapolis. Highest scoring game of the week. He was wide receiver 5 last week. At number 2, I like Malik Neighbors versus the Chargers. I think he's going to have a huge comeback week and do some big things there. And I really, really like him at number 2 this week. At wide receiver 3, I like Drake London versus Washington. It's at home in Atlanta. I know I had him faded last week. He was wide receiver 35, but I think against Washington, he'll come back and put up some points. At wide receiver 4 this week, I've got Justin Jefferson. Him and the Minnesota Vikings, again, shows that they're away at Pittsburgh, but remember that game's in Dublin, Ireland. He was wide receiver 30 last week, but I think he shows out in an international game this week. At wide receiver 5, I've got Nico Collins, who you can continue to fade him and do what you want to do, but last week he finished as wide receiver 6, and this week him and the Houston Texans are at home versus the Titans. At number 6, I've got Zay Flowers in what I think is going to be a shootout where the Ravens travel to Kansas City. Flowers was only wide receiver 88, and despite the fact that it was a 38-30 game, didn't get a ton involved. I think the Ravens changed that this week against Kansas City, and Flowers finishes as wide receiver 6. At wide receiver 7, it's one of my favorite guys I liked coming into this year. I thought he was going to be good. Rome Odunze. Him and the Chicago Bears are traveling to Las Vegas, and Odunze was wide receiver 20 last week. I'll touch a little bit more on why I like him so high at wide receiver 7 this week. At wide receiver 8, again, another one of those studs. He continues to stay in the top 10, doesn't drop further than that. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown. Despite the fact that they lost multiple coaches for the Lions, he's been good. They're at home this week versus the Cleveland Browns, and Amon-Ra and the Detroit Lions are going to look to get him going. He was wide receiver 7 this past week. At wide receiver 9, it's another breakout this year. It's Jackson Smith-Njigba. Him and the Seahawks are traveling to Arizona. They're going to play the Cardinals. Cardinals have a bin type of defense. I think Jackson gets his this week and eats. He was wide receiver 8 last week. I've got him at wide receiver 9 for this week coming forward. At number 10, I've got Jamar Chase, who's traveling to Denver with the Cincinnati Bengals. I know. We talked about that. They got Browning starting instead of Burrow and doing things like that. He was wide receiver 41 last week. The Bengals looked rough against the Vikings. I get it. I can't fade him any lower than number 11. At wide receiver 12 this week, I've got Jacobi Myers for the Las Vegas Raiders at home versus the Chicago Bears. Myers was wide receiver 39 last week, and I really like him this week. I'll touch on that here in just a second on my highlights from wide receiver. But first, let's hit an injury. It hit me personally this week in a couple teams, and I know it hit several of you. CeeDee Lamb gave everybody a goose egg. Ended up with an injured ankle. Some are saying high ankle sprain. He's yet to be completely ruled out. I think most fantasy sites have him as doubtful, but we'll see what happens there. It looks like he's probably going to miss some time, minimum probably 2 weeks, maybe more than that. We'll see how it goes. So hoping he's better. Keep an eye out on Jawan Jennings this week. He's kind of a day-to-day thing with San Francisco. Terry McLaurin also popped up on the injury report this week, and there's a quadriceps injury that he's got. He might miss some time. Each one of those 3 guys, if they're guaranteed to play, probably are right there fighting for that 10 through 12 spot for us. But at the end of the day, it's really, really hard not to look at the receivers that I like here and think Rome Odunze for the Chicago Bears going to Las Vegas. Like I said, wide receiver 20 this past week. The Rome is seeing elite wide receiver usage. He's had 27 targets in 3 weeks, so he's averaging 9 targets per week. Wide receiver 1 usage, 100%. He's wide receiver 3 overall in points per game behind only Puka and Amon-Ra. So those two studs who've been consistent all year, the only two players outpacing Odunze at this point. That Bears Vegas game, again, we touched on it earlier, 47.5 point over under. It looks to be a close game. The Bears are favored by 1.5 points, so it should be a close game. It's going to give us an indicator of both teams scoring, both teams in the mid-20s, possibly 30s. Gives us a shootout potential. I like Caleb Williams this week, and with the usage Odunze gets, I think he's going to be wide receiver 7 this week. At wide receiver 11 that I like there is Jacobi Myers. I like him better than consensus this week. He is at home for Las Vegas versus Chicago, so he's on the other side of the ball from Odunze. I think both these receivers are going to get peppered with targets in this game. Chicago gives up the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And, I think Geno trusts Jacobi. He knows that he's the playmaker on the outside for him. Brock Bowers has been kind of hindered, limited a little bit by some injury. I think Myers easily paces the team. He's got 8 more targets than the second receiver on the team, which is, I think it's Trey Tucker there. Myers just missed double digits last week. And with this being a close game, again, I think we have shootout potential. I think Myers and Odunze both eat and both finish as wide receiver 1s this week. My biggest fade, this kind of falls in line. Same thing as the Chase Brown fade at running back. I'm fading Brian Thomas Jr. this week for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They travel to San Francisco, so you're talking about a full coast-to-coast traveling trip, which usually rough anyway. Thomas Jr. was a wide receiver 50 last week, and I'll be honest, I think there's something real going on with his wrist. I've seen some rumor things and stuff like that. I haven't really seen anything official on injury reports, but he's got a sub 29% catch rate this year. And I just don't see that getting much better against San Francisco. I don't see how playing and practicing and doing stuff each week is going to help what that is. I love the talent, but so far, just like Chase Brown, like I said, despite that high volume, there's clearly an issue here. And BTJ hasn't cracked 10 points in a week this entire season. So wide receiver 50 last week, a lot of people still have him around that. I see fantasy sites having him projected as a top 12, top 14 receiver. And I can't do that. I think he's going to have a rough week, and I'm fading him. Tight end this week, a lot of matchups again. This is one of the first times we've kind of seen things shuffle around a little more than normal. 4 of our 12 tight ends we picked last week for tight end 1 usage or fantasy points. We only had 4 of 12 hit. Several tight ends who had been duds for the season, we kind of wrote them off. I'm looking at you, Mark Andrews, looking at what you did against the Lions. That was insane. But some of those guys kind of hit this week. Some of the old faithfuls hit and jumped back up towards the top. Hunter Henry was up there towards the top. Jake Ferguson had a ton of targets, a ton of catches this week. And, made it a tough week for us, 4 out of 12. My fade last week was Zach Ertz, one of the old faithfuls there. But I believed with Jaden Daniels out, Marcus Mariota playing quarterback there, he wouldn't get peppered with targets. That paid off for us as Ertz only finished as tight end 23 last week. So if you faded him and played a better option, you probably had a much better week than other people. The actual tight end rankings this week, it's the only one of the big triumvirate who keeps scoring, keeps putting up points here. I got Trey McBride as my wide receiver or tight end 1. He's at Arizona versus Seattle. He was tight end 6 last week. He's going to be a top 5 tight end this week. I think he'll be tight end 1. Tight end 2, I said he's kind of limited, but I like shootout potential there. It's Brock Bowers for the Raiders. They're at home versus the Chicago Bears. He was tight end 13 last week. Just missed the cut for being a tight end 1, tight end 12. But I like him at tight end 2 this week. Tight end 3, Another potential shootout game. I got my two top quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes at QB1, Lamar Jackson at QB2. I like Travis Kelce as my tight end 3 this week. He was only tight end 25 this past week, but at home versus Baltimore, I think he gets really hyped up for that. We saw a little sideline altercation with him and Andy Reid. I think there's going to be a fire lit. I see him getting peppered with targets. He'll be tight end 3 this week. And number 4, he had a down week last week, only finished as tight end 26, but I've got Tucker Kraft for the Packers, who are visiting Dallas. The Cowboys, like I said, terrible defense. Tucker Kraft is a yards after catch monster. His yak numbers will probably be huge in this game. He could even finish 4 or 5 wrecks and still approach 100 yards and a touchdown. So he could be in for a monster week. I like him at tight end 4. Tight end 5, we talked about it last week, is Juwan Johnson, the tight end for the New Orleans Saints. They're traveling to Buffalo to face the Bills. Bills are going to put up points on them. Juwan Johnson is a part of the game plan. He was tight end 9 last week. He'll get peppered with targets as tight end 5. Tight end 6 this week, I got Jake Ferguson for the Dallas Cowboys at home versus Green Bay. Green Bay's a tough defense. They kind of bend a little bit on tight end. They gave up some tight end run last week to Njoku a little bit and Fannin over for Cleveland. Ferguson was tight end 3 last week, just on crazy volume. I imagine, with CeeDee Lamb being out this week, double-digit targets for him is absolutely obtainable. Should keep him in the top 6. I like him at tight end 6. Tight end 7 is TJ Hawkinson for the Minnesota Vikings at Pittsburgh. Again, that's in Dublin, Ireland. It's going to be the early game Sunday morning. TJ was tight end 5 last week. He bounced back with Carson Wentz as a starting quarterback. I like him as tight end 7 this week. Tight end 8, I've got Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills at home versus New Orleans. Kincaid sprung up last week out of nowhere seemingly, but Kincaid truthers know the truth. He was tight end 4 last week. Anybody who follows Buffalo's receiving room has been waiting for somebody to kind of step up there. I'll get into that a little bit more here in a second on why I like Dalton Kincaid as tight end 8 this week. Tight end 9, it's the rookie Tyler Warren. He had a down week last week, tight end 23, but I like him to bounce back as tight end 9 this week against the LA Rams. They're in LA. Vegas, again, has that game at 49.5 points, the highest over-under. I like Tyler Warren to get peppered with targets. Should be a good game. Tight end 10, I've got David Njoku. Last couple of weeks, if you've been following me, I've had Harold Fannin Jr., the other tight end in Cleveland there. If you want to call him that, he lines out wide. He lines up in the backfield. He does all kinds of stuff. But there was some life from Njoku, and I'll touch on that in a second on why I like him as a tight end 1 this week at tight end 12. At tight end 11 this week, I like Kyle Pitts versus Washington. Atlanta's at home. He was tight end 20 last week in a terrible, terrible game against the Panthers where the Falcons lost 30-0. I think the Falcons are going to want to come out, really establish tempo there, and I think getting Pitts the ball is going to be a big deal. I think Penix is going to work on that. We heard him over the offseason say he wanted to get more touches to Pitts. I think last week was an issue with him. I think he'll pepper Pitts with some targets, and I like him at tight end 11. At tight end number 12 this week, I've got Hunter Henry. Old Faithful came back last week, jumped into the scoring bracket and said, you know what, I'm going to take over, and he was tight end 1 last week. This week, the Carolina Panthers come to New England to play the Patriots. Hunter Henry has a realistic shot at being a top 2 target there. Stephon Diggs is kind of slowly ramped up some, and we're watching Hunter Henry really, really get some touches after they stop him on the line. He's been actually blocking a lot more in line this season than he has in the years past to help Drake May. But I think they're going to slowly start leaking him out and doing some stuff. I like him as tight end 12 as a back-to-back tight end 1 week to week this week against the Carolina Panthers. The biggest injury we have at tight end is still George Kittle. He's out for the 49ers. He's going to be out for a while, so rank accordingly there. Goddard came back kind of last week. I think there might be some news if you want to monitor it on whether Darren Waller is going to be able to play this week for the Miami Dolphins. If he does, that could be an absolute stone's throw dart you just throw out there and hope that works. But the guys that I'm ahead on consensus this week, we talked about Dalton Kincaid. I like him as tight end 8 this week. New Orleans is in the bottom half of defenses at defending tight ends for fantasy purposes. They're 14th worst in the NFL. Over the last 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of the season here, Kincaid has 16 targets. He got 6 of those this past week against Miami. A huge factor for him is he's got a touchdown in 2 or 3 games. He's starting to establish himself as a real red zone threat for the Bills. And a positive game script plays into his favor, I think. Buffalo is 16.5-point favorites in this game against New Orleans. That's crazy. But at the same time, that also takes players like Keon Coleman and some other guys out where they're not going to have as many deep shots. Allen's going to take what the defense gives him easily. And I think Kincaid eats this week as tight end 8. My other tight end, I'm bigger on consensus in than other people. Like I said, David Njoku. I like him this week over Harold Fannin. He showed some life last week. The Browns are at Detroit. You know the Lions are going to put up tons of points, and they just continue to do that. And if they do, that game script is going to change and allow Njoku to get targeted. Yes, there's going to be some pressure there, but I think the pressure on Flacco, because, the Lions defense got 7 sacks against Lamar Jackson. That pressure is going to cause Flacco to hit underneaths and short routes, short, easy safety blanket throws to Njoku. Detroit gives up the 5th most points to tight ends in fantasy football. So they're kind of vulnerable there. I think Njoku had 7 targets last week. I would expect 7, maybe even 10 targets this week. The Browns are 8.5-point dogs to Detroit. So Detroit probably gets out ahead early despite the fact of the Browns' defense being pretty good. And I think Njoku gets peppered with targets. We're going to see a big game from him as tight end 10 this week. My biggest fade this week at tight end is Sam LaPorta in that same game. He's the tight end for the Detroit Lions. He finished tight end 22 last week. I don't know what else I can say about Cleveland. They're pretty stingy against tight ends. They held Tucker Kraft to 5.9 last week. Mark Andrews, who bounced back as a top tight end this past week, they held him to 1.4 the week before that. To be honest, the Cleveland Browns are stingy against every position. They're just a top defense right now, and they're hard to play against, hard for offenses to get going. Stack that with the fact LaPorta only has 1 game all season with more than 4 targets. It was week 1 where Detroit trailed early against Green Bay, and they kind of went into comeback mode. I don't see that happening here. And outside of that first week, LaPorta hasn't hit double digits at all, so I'm fading him this week. I think he's probably going to be in the tight end 20s again, and I would suggest fading him. And with that said, that's a wrap on our week 4 offensive player rankings. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you got some information out of it, some much-needed stuff. I know waivers are coming up for a lot of leagues coming up tomorrow. Keep an eye on those waivers, and we should have another great week of NFL action. Be sure to keep an eye on the week 4 offensive player finishes that I ranked here. See if they match up with what my rankings say. If you're on X, give me a follow at JKeasy, at JKEASY. And, hey, who are you ranking at the top? Who are your top guys? Who are the guys you're fading? Who are you? Who would you not play no matter what this week? And while you're doing that, you want some input, figure out some other things, check out all of the great content over at IDP Plus and Big Guy Fantasy Sports. Consistency tools, rankings, IDP, offensive, everything you could possibly need. Tons of video content on YouTube. Check out the YouTube channels as well. And guess what, guys? I'll see you next week. Good luck on your waivers. And remember, next week, bye weeks kick in. We're going to start seeing players on bye, so we're going to see some of the rankings pop and change. Plan accordingly. Good luck, and until next time.
Thank you for watching the IDP Plus YouTube network. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Be sure to tap the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.